If I were to ask you what animal is more important to human history, the horse or the dog, which one would you pick? If you're familiar with me, my work, or this channel, you know I'm picking the dog. It's been around for 20,000 years. It's the most complex symbiotic relationship, in my opinion, in the animal kingdom. However, a second runner-up, and if not the winner of that, question, I think would go to the horse, if not the dog. And that got me thinking, where do horses come from? What are the earliest horse remains? How did horse domestication happen? And obviously, horses evolved and died out here in the Americas, at the end of the Ice Age, but were rebrought to the continent by the Spanish and French and British explorers later on, and reintroduced and reintegrated back onto the landscape in North America. And that's a complex cultural and political issue today. However, I'm not a horse expert, though I do know some, and I've had them come onto this podcast to interview them here. Mainly what this current video is going to be is an interview with Dr. Wiliam Taylor, who just wrote the book on horses, the academic book on the domestication of horses, and that's called Hoofbeats. And Will's going to take us through the earliest remains of horses, the earliest instances of human interaction with horses, as well as, how the horse was domesticated, and then several what I would call ethnoequineology, same as ethnocynology, meaning human and dog, ethnoequineology, meaning human and horse interactions in the world. The second video will be with my friend Cassidy Thornhill, who did her master's thesis on an early horse that was found here in Wyoming on the plains, that was found at a time when, some horses were reintegrating back onto the American plains after they were reintroduced by possibly the Norse, but definitely the Spanish, French, and English, and how those horses were becoming adopted and, used and utilized by indigenous peoples and becoming part of their mythologies and their cultures. And thirdly, we're going to interview Dr. Carlton Shield-Chief Gover, who, does, indigenous radiocarbon dating work on the plains. However, he's also done quite a bit of research in the Caribbean, scuba diving and doing some underwater archaeology for early horse remains, because it's a little difficult to find horses, it's kind of a needle in the haystack of all of North America to find horses at that time here on the plains. However, it's a little more straightforward to dive down into the Caribbean and look at early Spanish and Portuguese caravels and galleons and look for horseshoes or any evidence of horse bones or remains, usually in the form of horseshoes, in the Caribbean, which would signify, the earliest dates for which horses were brought to the Caribbean and therefore the Americas. So without further ado, we're going to interview Dr. Wiliam Taylor, the expert on the domestication of the horse. So here we go.
I'm Wiliam Taylor. I'm an assistant professor at the University of Colorado.
And then what's the name of your book?
The book is called Hoofbeats: How Horses Shape Human History.
So again, if you're familiar with me and my work, you understand that, dogs were domesticated in Siberia. It's hunter-gatherers were coming out of Africa into Eurasia, interacting with Pleistocene wolves, and that domestication process was starting. You can see my lecture on that in multiple videos. However, I don't know anything about how horses, came to be, how that early horse interaction started with humans. So I asked Will, can you elaborate and tell me more about, the earliest evidence of horse domestication?
This is a question folks have been trying to answer for a long time. It's one of the questions that's probably shifted the most in the last 30 years. Folks have been looking for clues to the first horse domestication, generally in the steppes of Eurasia. Focus has long been, especially on western steppes of Eurasia or Eastern Europe. And the timelines that folks have thrown out range from, tens of thousands of years ago up until more recent centuries. In the last 10 years, there's been a lot of innovation in what we can learn from, especially from ancient genetics. And these have kind of helped us kind of hone in on the when and the where, if not the why, that the ancestors of domestic horses alive today appear for the first time. And it's now pretty clear from looking at that information that the first domestic horses showed up not very long before about 2000 BC. And the place that this first population of domestic horses emerged is the steppes north of the Caucasus Mountains, kind of sandwiched between the Black Sea and the Caspian Sea. Might be more, fresh in people's minds as basically the kind of Ukrainian war zone here today.
Next, it's always been my understanding that horses evolved here in the Americas, much like camels and early canids evolved here, but then took the land bridge back into the Old World, and then died out at the end of the Pleistocene, either from climatic shifts or the arrival of stone tool and fire wielding apes that, were very good at hunting. So I ask Will, is the story of the horse an American one?
Yeah. So the evolution of horses and their relatives alive today, the genus that we know as Equus, really takes us back to somewhere between the last 2 to 4 million years. Depending on whether you ask a paleontologist or a geneticist, you might get a slightly different number, but basically to the beginning of the Pleistocene, the last ice age. And these ancestors definitely came from North America. There were pulses of connectivity linking the Americas with Eurasia and beyond, into Africa. The kind of horsiest of the horses here, we sometimes call caboline horses, spread especially into kind of colder grassland zones of Eurasia and Africa. Even the kind of Mediterranean coast of North Africa would have had some sort of caboline horses in the last ice age. And what we're more recently discovering is actually it's not just one dispersal out of the Americas, but in fact at times that Beringia was connected, there was kind of back and forth going on over the last few million years of high latitude horse populations kind of going one direction or another. But it is true that, basically all the horses of the ancient world, all the horses that are around today, ultimately have a kind of a fundamental North American evolutionary context and shared heritage there.
So moving back to dogs for a second, like I said earlier, the earliest interactions with humans and wolves in Eurasia started the domestication process and all that. And obviously we know from, dog remains at sites or early, pieces of bone and stuff that could be wolf or dog, but around the time of domestication. Anyway, I ask Will, what's the earliest evidence of human-horse interaction in the Old World?
So this is a great question, and the answer to it depends a lot on what kind of interaction you're looking for. With horses, it's really interesting that basically horses are one of the first taxa you can really conclusively point to as a prey animal for humans. We have rarely, when you go that far back in human history, do you actually have something that looks like a smoking gun for early hunting. But there are sites, like the most famous one being the site of Schöningen in Germany, in which actual spears used to hunt horses were preserved in the kind of unique depositional context. Originally, you used to hear the number 400,000 years ago. I think the site recently got redated and is thought now to potentially be associated with Neanderthals at around 200 or so thousand years ago. But there's actually co-occurrence of their butchered horse remains and co-occurrence of early hominins and horses that go back to 750,000 years ago in the UK, and their first moment of being found together in the fossil record is almost 2 million years ago. So, these interactions probably go back basically to what it means to be human in latitudes where horses lived, which would have been higher latitude grassland, cooler grassland areas of Eurasia. The relationship took a turn into some other kinds of interactions too that we can see in the earliest human artwork, right? So Paleolithic art, somebody did a tally of all the images of animals in Eurasian and even North African cave paintings and found that horses are the most common animal if you just tally up the number of animals in these Paleolithic paintings. And so you start to see horses emerge in artwork, and probably there's a ceremony and belief component to that too at 40,000 years ago. And those are interactions I think that are interesting and important. But probably the meat behind your question is when and how did we get into something that looked more like management or domestication, right? And this is a very hard thing to track. It's a very disputed and contentious corner of archaeological science, but the most straightforward indicator we have of a domestic interaction between people and horses is when we find them being buried in human burials with things like chariots and bridle equipment. And there's really not a big gap between their genetically our first, appearance of the ancestors of modern domestic horse and the first appearance of these kind of like transport focused, burial contexts where we can see spoked wheels and bridles and kind of a chariot culture. So, folks have long been on the lookout for these kind of gradual, multi-century long lead up of shifting interactions. And, it's a little bit hard to say what that process of early horse domestication truly was like. But in my view, it honestly might have been more closer to the snap of the fingers than to this multiple millennia, sort of buildup.
Moving on, I had heard that an early, attempt or an early theory or hypothesis at understanding horse domestication possibly came from their use of, people wanting to drink their milk. They were like kind of like we milk goats or cows. People might have been milking horses. I'd heard that tangentially in several books, actually. So I asked Will, can you elaborate on that? Were horses being, domesticated for their milk?
Yeah, definitely. So one trajectory that people view as playing into the horse domestication these days comes mostly from the site of Botai in northern Kazakhstan. And the idea here is, based on things like the isotope values of ceramic sherds found at Botai, that folks were collecting horse milk, and that milk and meat were sort of the origins of the domestication process with horses. This was a pretty, I think, viable interpretation of the data back when the idea was put together. I think it was based on a kind of a technological approach that, if it's not totally defunct, I think is a little miscalibrated to the question. Today in 2025, it's basically an isotope measurement from a fat residue in a sherd is multiple chains of argument to make that into a milk argument. It's very, very indirect, and there's a lot of room for error. So I'm, in looking back on this now with some of the tools that we have today, and there's been a couple of really interesting papers on this topic recently using much better and more direct indicators of milk in the archaeological record, especially human dental calculus, right, as a way to sort of mineral capsule of the proteins that were actually in people's mouths. And the milk proteins for specific species of animal are actually traceable. So there was this, big survey of a lot of the burials from the North Caucasus over the last, 8,000 years, published in 2022. It didn't find any horse milk until 1000 BC. But it did find milk proteins from across this whole period, right? And, other folks have looked for milk proteins in the Botai site itself and found, sort of come up empty-handed. My view now is that I don't put much credence in the idea that these ceramic lipid residues are associated with horse milk. They're probably from horse fat, but not all that surprising of a conclusion at a site where almost 100% of the animal bones are from horses.
Moving on, Will pointed out that horses are among the most, if not the most, represented animal in Paleolithic cave art. Fun fact, dogs and humans are almost entirely absent from European Paleolithic cave art, which I find interesting. Humans make sense because you can't really paint yourselves. There might have been taboo, but there's no wolves either. Not like whether they were dogs or wolves is hard to tell anyway, but no wolves. And I thought, is that to do with, you don't want to scare the prey away, but there's tons of bears, hyenas, lions, there's all sorts of stuff. So that is interesting. Sidebar aside, and moving on, one of the best examples of Paleolithic art, not just cave art, but art, comes from the Vogelherd horse that's found in Europe. And it's just this beautiful ivory carving of a horse. And I have Will, elaborate on that here.
Yeah, so the Vogelherd horse is a really nice, beautiful example, I think, of horses starting to sort of embed in different parts of human life and culture. It is, one of the earliest representations of human artwork and definitely of horses. And it's extraordinary. It's beautiful. It's abstract, but also sort of anatomically anchored. When I have young kids come to the museum and I want them to understand the sort of gravity and depth of the connection with horses, I give them a little replica of the Vogelherd horse to hold in their hands, because I think it's sort of it travels you back in time to, the relationship between people and horses, tens of thousands of years ago. And, so I view those things with a sort of an awe and a reverence that tell you that there was more to this connection than purely like what's for dinner, right? In addition to being the number one animal in kind of cave painting artwork, horses are, I believe, in fact, the most frequent animal in terms of zooarchaeological assemblages. They might be in competition with the reindeer and some other, bison, these sort of things for that title. But there are extraordinary archaeological assemblages from across Europe, Western Europe, Central Europe, Eastern Europe, and even, places like Siberia and horse country across Eurasia that show hunting horses was a big deal. And often, we end up with these sites where much or even most all of the fauna from that hunting is that one taxa, right? People had obviously learned that, you can't chase down a horse with a rock or something, right? They run away. That's kind of the whole adaptation. They've evolved to get away from predators. And so our strategies for hunting them reflect a understanding of the landscape, their behavior, their ecology. And we pick their favorite watering hole or their favorite migration corridor and often ambush them, right? So you find these sites that are connected to the landscape and specifically about horses. So you have hundreds or thousands of horse bones here, butchered and reflective of, this kind of very horse-focused choice that ancient hunters made.
As an archaeologist, when I'm not in the field collecting data, I spend a lot of time, and I mean a lot of time, right here at my desk. And I'm sure many of you can empathize with this, but over time, my desk starts to just fill up with junk. At a given moment, and especially right now, I have a couple stone tools and a dog skull just sitting on my desk, and as well as a couple cups, other things, a pen. It just starts to pile up, and it becomes its own archaeological site. However, that's where Curiosity Box steps in, because it's a box that feeds your curiosity, not your clutter. What I like about Curiosity Box is that when you sign up, they'll send you a new box in the mail filled with gadgets, games, and other STEM-based items that are curated by scientists not only to be entertaining, but also educational. In fact, just this month, they sent me some ones that weren't just cool, but also useful to me in my everyday life, especially always being in arm's reach. Specifically, this one here, which is a slat band ruler that measures inches and centimeters so I can measure artifacts quickly at my desk, and when I'm done, I have it here on my wrist. Especially I can bring this into the field and also have something, within arm's reach or around my arm itself rather than misplace it in a bucket or somewhere else or someone takes it away from me. Another item they sent me that I really like is this 4D tape measure. Now, as an archaeologist, I always need a tape measure to measure artifacts, to measure depths and a level when I'm digging, but also this one can measure time. Normally, as an archaeologist, I rely on carbon dating, but if I'm ever in a pinch, this 4D tape measure can also, once you set the center of mass and push it back and forth as a pendulum, can measure Galilean time, which is pretty cool. So if you too would like to up your home office archaeology game and like to reduce the clutter but add more curiosity to your desk, I highly advise you sign up for Curiosity Box. Anybody who uses code DAVID25 or the link below can get 25% off their first box. And if none of that is of interest to you, it might make a great gift for somebody you know for the holidays. So again, use code DAVID25 or the link in the description for 25% off your first box. Now let's get back to the video. Next, I bring up to Will, the topic of horses being reintroduced into the Americas has become quite a controversial cultural and political discussion, because scientifically horses go extinct at the end of the Ice Age in the Americas. However, two recent books by Paulette Steeves and Yvette Running Horse Collins have pointed out that, Indigenous oral histories have said that horses have been here since time immemorial, the same as they have, or, depending on the nation or the tribe or the people, you can't paint as a monolith. So with that, I asked Will to talk about the archaeological perspective of horses and what are his thoughts on that in the Americas.
There's some interesting archaeological sites that demonstrate that early peoples of both North and South America, were pretty engaged with the kind of homegrown wild horses that lived on the landscape. They're the sites in the high Beringian Yukon, like Bluefish Caves, that point to folks even before the ice sheets opened up, potentially having a hunter-prey relationship with horses. And around, the kind of Rocky Mountain zone, you have sites like Wally's Beach in southern Alberta, which show that in kind of this Pleistocene-Holocene transition, folks were still sort of hunting horses when they had the opportunity. There's really cool localities, even in places like Florida, that show horse bones being used for tools and some other things which indicate a connection between people and horses here related to the early presence of humans in the Americas. We don't have the most precise model for exactly how those horse populations shifted across North America, but what I can suggest here is that these Ice Age horse populations that did live here were probably pretty cold adapted. And it seems that as the Holocene warmed, the places that those horses were living adjusted a little bit, and it seems to have sort of gradually shifted to higher latitudes. Our last scientific indicator of those horses being present in North America would put us probably at 5,000 or 6,000 years, and it's coming from things like sedimentary DNA in the high Yukon, for example. So kind of along a trajectory that you might find in other taxa, like the mammoth, right? That were really kind of an Ice Age steppe animal, shifting northwards to some degree. It's probable that those, human hunting had a relationship with those animals too. It's much more difficult to say, with any confidence whether there was some role for hunting in their changing population distributions of the Holocene. But we did a project where we radiocarbon dated and genomically sequenced a lot of the earliest domestic horses that we could find across Western North America. And what we found is that these horses here pop up across places like southern Wyoming, even as far as Idaho, Kansas, really a broad swath of the American West, show up at around the turn of the 1600s. And these horses are, at least the ones that have so far been identified here, of kind of a fundamentally Iberian ancestry, right? That means that they're ancestrally connected to populations of horses that were brought over through Spanish settlements further south in North America. I think there's more interesting things to explore about that, but what our research does show is that this is a much faster dispersal of those horses to very, very far away localities, right? Basically what in the States we would call the Northern Rockies, the edges of the Missouri, most of what we think of as the heart of the American West, very, very rapidly from their first arrival in Spanish settlements, which in mainland North America would have taken place, around 1520, right? So a few decades is pretty much all it took for horses to go from this kind of, European introduced domesticate that might have been thought of as part of the colonial process here into spreading into places where you're not going to see another European here for, in some cases, decades or centuries, right? And so I think that that's a really interesting and exciting discovery. It does, so far we haven't found any, evidence of a, lingering presence of these kind of Ice Age lineages of horses that were definitely part of this landscape not that long ago, 10, 12, 15,000 years ago in most parts of the American West.
So I interject here, and I this is surprising to me, but I ask Will, can you elaborate? So if I'm hearing you correctly, it seems like horses may have appeared to indigenous peoples before they even interacted with the European American. Is that correct? Yeah,
and I think the more that we dig into this, the more complex and interesting that finding has become. I think it's now very possible that European people were not even the vector that spread horses into what is today the United States for the first time. There's historic records and other, sort of footing to suggest that native folks in northern Mexico might have had the horse and been helping to spread and disperse and exchange these horses through kind of, their own networks of movement and exchange into the Southwest and up the Rockies here, even before you had a permanent settlement in places like, Spanish New Mexico, for example.
And with that, I interject here to ask one more question. Were the horses that were brought by the Spanish, Portuguese, French, English, or whoever, were they released? Did they get set wild? Did something happen? Is there like a specific incident that you know of? And can you elaborate on that?
Yeah, so this is an interesting question, and one that I think our thinking has shifted a lot in kind of Western academia. It was often taken for granted that Spanish kept tight control over their horses. In many places, there were literally laws on the books that said, native people are not allowed to have horses. And I think for a while that was often taken as face value, as evidence that they didn't. More recently, I think, historians have taken a critical lens to that and started to think, well, if there's a law on the books, it sort of implies that there's an underlying problem here to begin with, right? And, we can only make some basic inferences about what was going on that would have helped spread these horses. But it's been interesting to me to see other contexts where you have horses moving into a purely empty landscape on their own as wild animals. One example that's, studied quite a lot on this is Australia, where horses have only been around, roughly 200 years. And so there are areas in which they're sort of spread into landscapes that they were not, is more like measured and documented, and you could even get like a rate. And it turns out, that in those situations, horses are often pretty slow. They're very territorial animals, right? And they're social animals. So they kind of going into an empty landscape, they're not sort of sprinting as far as they can go to see what's at the end, right? Their mechanisms of dispersal are kind of like, well, can't quite get access to my, compete for control over this harem, and so, maybe I'm going to go nearby and kind of fight over it. And, so ultimately that process, at least from that analogy, is probably not fast enough to explain these kind of extraordinarily, rapid continent scale spreads. We have some other evidence to suggest that, other things like horse equipment spread too. And it looks to me a lot more plausible to suggest that it was really trade and exchange and social networks of people, native folks, that spread horses through most of the American West.
Following that, I then ask Will, is it due to their, evolutionary history here in the Americas that horses do so well? And is that, part of why there's such a, BLM horse problem, and there's such a debate as to whether horses are invasive or not and things like that? Can you elaborate there?
Yeah, it's interesting to see, this is one of the more complex issues on wildlife management across the West today, because there are many areas in which horses do extraordinarily well. And in fact, horses are doing well in areas that I don't think anybody would classify as like great horse habitat, but they're simply there because, it's sort of a remote area. They're very, sort of successful and adaptable animals, and in areas with like a low population density and that sort of thing, they can kind of get away with it. But it was not that long ago that there was wild horse populations in a much more extraordinary scale across the West. And I think their ancestral connection to, the kind of Pleistocene ecology of the Americas definitely plays a part in that. Horses are grassland animals, and they're good ones, and we have a lot of grasslands. Over the centuries since their domestication, horses have also, managed to be adapted to both human and human adjacent environments pretty well. They've gotten much more successful in warm environments. The path of the horse through the Americas is not simply from, the Eurasian steppes into, Colorado or Wyoming. It was via, the Arabian Peninsula and North Africa to Iberia to Mexico, right? And so these animals that are around today have, probably not suffering some of the same ecological challenges that might have faced down your Pleistocene horses too. So I do think that their success in the American West speaks to, in many ways, some of that evolutionary history. It also speaks to some of that long-term domestication history. And I think that's part of what makes it such a complicated topic.
Moving on, for me, I haven't ever found a dog at a site myself. I've seen dog bones, but I've never found like a dog burial. In order to find dogs archaeologically, you need to find evidence of gnaw marks on bones to find their presence at least. And if you're lucky, you get to find dog bones or even a complete burial, which would be a pipe dream of mine. However, I ask Will here, I don't know anything about horses. How do you find horses archaeologically? Like, how do you study them?
One of the amazing things about horses is that our search for domestication is very closely wrapped up in the search for horse transport. And horse transport, is this big, mechanical, challenging process, right? That leaves pretty remarkable indicators on the actual, living tissues of a horse, which include their bones, right? We as humans know that our bones respond to our repeated sort of choices, activities that we make in life. That's why my knee hurts from basketball and my lower back, is sort of locking up from sitting there writing emails, 10 hours a day, every day. Horse transport, carrying a human rider or pulling a big heavy cart, sort of on the extreme end of the mechanical activities that animals will go through. And what we've been able to sort of build an understanding of over the years is that almost any kind of horse transport, doesn't matter whether you're riding without a bit or riding without a saddle, or almost any flavor or variation of horse transport you want to come up with, is going to leave some kind of an indicator in the animal skeleton that's potentially recognizable. And I think that's what differentiates in many ways our search for clues to horse domestication from some of these other human-animal relationships where you don't have that transport element. It is a much more direct link between the human-animal interactions and like the skeleton of the animals themselves. So that's like by far and away our best and most direct indicator of domestication in horses, in my view. Now, there's also some artifacts that kind of follow along with that, right? One of the most useful here is the equipment used to control horses themselves. And we have, with horses, apparently, a unique technological innovation that is the sort of bridle with a mouthpiece, right? Or what we would call a bit, right? So there are material culture indicators of that horse transport that go along with the skeletal ones. They're not totally without their challenges. A lot of the early horse equipment was organic. And so you often only get the rigid components made out of bone or antler that survive, and there can be ambiguity in finding those. And of course, there are other things that join the fray and the search too. Oftentimes, as with dogs, as with other animals, one of the most compelling and hard to interpret things is their appearance in things like a burial or that sort of thing. They speak to an intimacy, but they're also kind of a reading the tea leaves kind of a situation. So later on in the journey, you end up with things like historic records and art and some things that are, almost impossible to argue with. So.
Next, something I talked about with Will, in person outside of this interview before, like maybe a year or two ago, is the idea that horses, we weren't riding them for that long. It's actually pretty recent. In fact, like the Iliad at the time of the Battle of Troy, the Bronze Age in Greece, how we first started riding horses, horseback riding, not just chariots. And the stirrup famously wasn't even invented till like almost 1,000 or so years ago, and was like, I think Time Magazine's #1 like invention of the millennia, because it just made humans like one with the horse essentially, especially for like knights and stuff like that. But even Alexander the Great famously didn't have stirrups on his horse. He just rode with like a little pelt on the back of a horse, like barely a saddle. So horseback riding was new. Will, can you elaborate and tell the audience more about horseback riding and how that came about and when?
Yeah, so one of the, I think, more confounding aspects of the archaeological record is you don't actually see direct evidence for horse riding a whole lot in the archaeological record early on. So the first chariot burials show up around 2000 BC, and in a lot of the early, depictions, artwork, historic records, it's like chariot, chariot, chariot across, Eurasian archaeological sites. That doesn't mean that people weren't riding horses. And in fact, I think, in the book, I go into detail as to what are some of the earliest contexts where we see clear, indisputable evidence for horse riding. One of them are these incredible murals from ancient Egypt in the New Kingdom, right? So horses introduced into Egypt in the 1700 BC-ish time period by probably through foreign invaders, right? And sort of bring an end to the old kingdom. By the time the New Kingdom starts to get its act together, horses are really much a part of sort of representations of authority and power. And if you ever go to like Luxor or some of these places, you can see these incredible entire buildings painted with the horse, army of Ramses the Great. And if you look closely at some of these, not just Ramses, but some earlier ones too, you can see that they're amidst these massive chariot battles that are depicted on here. You can see some little horse riders hiding off in the side. They're usually like naked. They're often sitting in kind of a weird position on the horse, a little bit further back than you would think you would normally sit. They're often doing something very specific, like holding a message or something like that. And kind of an interpretation of this is that it's not that people couldn't ride horses, and clearly in some cases they would choose to do so. But I think these contexts show you that there was a trade-off to horse transport in the early days, right? That it was chosen when things like speed were being prioritized over safety and control. And when you wanted to do something super chaotic, like bring your, guys on with horses into a combat situation, people were making different choices as to how to do that effectively. And one of the things that probably played a role in this is the technology that we actually used to control horses. Remember, I said the first horse equipment was mostly organic. So people literally, with the Sintashta culture at 2000 BC, just had like a soft piece of probably leather in the animal's mouth. Imagine your level of control of trying to take a horse into battle, with that sort of a framework, and then it chews through the leather or something like that. Across the second millennium BC, you see experimentation with new ways to control a horse. You see new kinds of bit appear. Bits get made out of metal. They're initially still these kind of straight metal bars. And right around the time you start to see horses in like your Egyptian artwork and whatever, you actually have the invention of the kind of jointed metal mouthpiece, which I don't think it was a magic bullet for, blink your eyes and you had horse riding, but I think it started to allow people to communicate a little more urgently and effectively with nuance in high intensity situations in a way that the horse could kind of mechanically understand. And we see, different trajectories in different parts of the world in terms of when horse riding started to be used in battle. And I think there's a lot of parallels between the equipment side and the cavalry side of things with horses. One of my other favorite little snapshots into the logic of early horse transport, probably the first depiction of cavalry being used in a dated archaeological context, comes from Assyria around 900 BC. And if you look closely, and there's a panel of this actually in the book, it's actually two riders riding side by side. One's got the bow and arrow and the other is holding the reins. And I think it's suggesting that horse control was messy, right? At 2000 BC, we basically still had a wild animal here, kind of zebra level behavior, trying to get them to do things with transport and battle and these sort of things. So as horse breeding and selection made the animals more tractable, friendlier, more controllable, we also had changing technologies that allowed us to do more sorts of mechanical communication with the horse that I think opened up the possibility of using them in other ways, and when you didn't need to sort of cling to their back naked with your message, and you could do more complex and dangerous things while you're actually on the animal's back, which is a very, evolutionarily, we're talking about one of humanity's first prey animals. To be sitting in their sort of blind spot on their back is quite a spot to be physiologically, emotionally, behaviorally for the horse. And I think that first transport system, the chariot system, probably that was just a little more stable, comfortable, manageable for the horses. Another instance of that is in the early 20th century, people even effectively used zebras in a lot of these kind of chariots and carts in different corners of the world, New York, South Africa, this sort of thing.
Moving on to ethnoequinology, and much like ethnocynology, with the study of dogs in human cultural contexts, dogs, anywhere they exist on the world or on the planet, they also share cultural roles and traditions, either in the creation stories, mythologies, religious practices, or just everyday culture where humans live. So, where people exist, dogs exist, and there's culture with that. So I ask Will then, can you give me some examples of ethnoequinology, or just, can you talk about horses and human culture, and what are some cool examples of that?
Most of my connection with horses from a research perspective comes out of time spent here in the American West and time spent in the steppes of Mongolia. And I think, both of those experiences have given me a sense of the sort of intensity and depth and reverence and connection that people living in horse country have developed over the centuries. For me, the most extraordinary, I think, snapshots into that come out of Mongolia, which is not surprising. It's been for at least 3,500 years, one of the most horse-connected places on the planet. And in Mongolia culture today, when a horse passes away, folks will take the head of that horse and put it in a place of reverence. So you can go to a mountain pass and feel like you're in the middle of nowhere and come across an enormous stone cairn that has, prayer flags and the skulls or heads of dozens of, beloved horses that have passed on and then have been treated with this sort of like reverence and respect that, it's hard for that to not feel like a spiritual type of experience and connection. And that, in my, interaction and engagement with, especially with Native folks here in the Western U.S., you can kind of feel some of these parallels and similarities in terms of the link between horses and people's, belief in the world around them. And so that's pretty special in my view.
After that answer, I had some follow-up questions, but Will wanted to follow up with another specific example of ethnoequinology, so I let him elaborate on that here.
Oh, I'll pick another anecdote here that I think is pretty special because it's a corner of the world that doesn't get a ton of respect for being a horse culture. It's often thought of and framed as in Australia, and in fact, most of the Pacific, Australasia as well, that horses were purely a tool of sort of colonialism, right? But there's a rock art site in Queensland, in a place called Lara, that has the most extraordinary mural of a giant horse and kind of the northeastern coast of Australia, painted by Aboriginal folks here. that I think is this beautiful testament to their connection with horses and emotional, spiritual, but also I think, logistical connection between native folks and horses in other corners of the world, even if the time depth has led people to maybe dismiss the significance of those connections.
Of course, as two anthropologists do when they're talking to each other, fascinating stuff pops up, and I have a million more questions, and we start talking. So between the interview here, this is the next thing he wanted to bring up with ethnoequinology. So, Will?
In terms of anecdotes about horses too, I think one of the most exciting chapters of the story that doesn't get into our school curricula and history books here in the U.S. is the connection of people and horses in South America, in Patagonia, in the Pampas. Really some incredible horse cultures down in this region. And one of the things, I was lucky enough to work with a team of Argentinian archaeologists on some early horse sites, really at the southern tip of Patagonia, the edge of the world, the edge of the continent. And we found there is the same pattern we see here in North America, which is that horses spread extraordinarily fast. They got deeply integrated into, native indigenous cultures down there. And, the world that emerged in the Pampas here was one in which, people would run away to go live in the horse cultures of the Pampas, right? In which there was like trade and economy and sovereignty of again, almost a continent in scale in terms of the scope of these sort of networks and polities that emerged this important and globally significant grassland. And it's sad, I think, that the scope of that, their kind of cultural achievements as a horse culture often kind of get overlooked there. So we did a little bit of archaeology on that, and it's one of my favorite parts of the book too.
So lastly, I asked Will here, hey, you just wrote the book on horses, the academic book on the early history of horses and horse domestication. Is there anything that I didn't bring up that you'd like to answer? And just for the audience listening, if you want to buy Will's book or check it out, it's on Audible. You can also check it out on Amazon. The link is below. You can check that out as well. But Will, so anything else from your book that you'd like to talk about?
I just would encourage folks to check out the book. I think there's only so much you can share in a short interview, and the book is really kind of for the folks that would like to dive into the nitty-gritty. I'm a visual person, so there's a lot of pretty pictures, and one of the things that I try to do is take us around the world to places that might not always pop up on your list of horse cultures, West Africa, the Pacific, and get into the archaeology of the story of people and horses in those places too.
So with that, I'd like to go back to the question I asked at the beginning. Are dogs more important to human history or horses? Did your mind change here? Let me know what you think in the comments. Are horses more important or dogs more important? Dogs are probably more socially and romantically would not be the word, but lovingly more important to humans, though people do have, affection and great bonds with horses as well, the same as we do with dogs, but I believe it's more biologically, designed in dogs to be that close with humans. And remember, if you want to stick around for the next interview, where I interview Cassidy Thornhill, who talked about, an early horse that was found on the plains that was possibly adopted by an indigenous tribe that was, possibly there before, they even saw a white man. Pretty interesting. One of the earliest examples of horses on the plains at that time. Please hit the like button. Please subscribe if you'd like to see that. And you can listen to the podcast this is Ethnocynology with David Ian Howe. You can listen to it on Apple, Spotify, Stitcher, everywhere you get your podcasts, but the YouTube version will be here on YouTube. So, and if you have questions for Will, he does teach at CU Boulder, so you can reach out to him there, or if you leave some comments here in the YouTube video, I'm sure he'll check on them, or I can let him know which questions were asked, and I can send some good ones over to him. So, and any other questions you want answered about horses, I can try to get those into the next interviews. So with that, thank you. Please like, subscribe, do the whole thing, and we're out.